ultimate showdown between good and evil. Also good. Hi, I'm Sarah. Welcome back to my channel. I realized in the midst of quarantine and the pandemic that I have read a lot of books about quarantines, epidemics, plague, pandemic, apocalypses, about the end of the world, specifically with a focus on plagues. And I thought I'd make a video ranking all of them. I had 8 books all ready to go, but I decided to read 2 more to really round everything out. It took me a really long time, so I probably should have just filmed the video 2 months ago, but who knows, maybe this will be in time for the second wave. Hopefully not, but you never know. I've got 10 books that I read, and I'm going to rank them all, starting with my least favorites. So at the bottom of the list, I have 3 books that I rated 2 stars. All of these were rated 2 stars for kind of different reasons, but I think my least favorite out of them was The Passage. Most people may say that this is not a plague or pandemic book, that this is a zombie apocalypse novel. To which I say, what is a zombie apocalypse novel if not a spreading of a disease that makes zombies? This book really let me down because it is enormous. I think it's like 1,000 pages or something like that. And for the first 100 to 200, the first like good third of the book maybe, is all about where the zombie virus came from and how it all got started. And I got really invested in that. Like I was into the characters, I was feeling the plot, I was feeling the story, everything was fine. And then the zombies get loose, as they do, and bam, the book jumps forward 100 years. So the whole like plague part of the book, the part that I was really invested in, doesn't actually happen in this book. So if that is what you are looking for, do not go with this one. You spend so much time on the first chunk of the book and those characters in the background, and then everything just jumps forward till more or less all of those people are dead. And you have to get attached to this whole new group of characters, and you learn about the post-apocalyptic world, and it's not terrible, but it's just so long, and it's almost like it should have been divided into 2 different books, where the first book was the whole before and the plague part of it, and then the second book was more of the post-apocalypse part of it. And this actually is a series. There's more of these, which I have no plans to read because I didn't really care for this one. But if you're going to do a series as it is, this should have been split into 2 books. My next 2-star read was The Plague. I picked this book specifically to read last month for this video because I saw it advertised as a slim book about the plague. So I thought it'd be interesting to read kind of a plague classic, if you will. And this book took me forever to read, and I hated it. I hated every single word of it. I would not have gotten through this book if I did not want to make this video, because I literally would just have to read on my Kindle 10% of it every day. And I'm like, just 10% today, and then you'll be done in 4 days, you know, that type of thing, just to get through this. For a book that is about the plague just doesn't seem to be in it that much. So this takes place in a small town in, I believe it's Africa, like the northern coast of Africa. And you're following the main character is a doctor who is treating all the plague victims. So you feel, or you think you're going to be right up in the plague. And it's just not. It follows this doctor, and then he's got this group of like 3 other guys that he's friends with, and it follows their stories. And for the most part, they don't get the plague. No one they're friends with gets the plague. None of their family gets the plague. They're just like contemplating their existence and the morality of the plague. And just no. I looked this book up when I was like halfway through it and did a little more research. And I guess it's not really supposed to be a plague novel. It's supposed to be a philosophy novel. And I guess it just wasn't what I was looking for. But it was really hard to read. It was extremely dry. And there are pretty much no women in this book, which I understand in the 1940s, like you kind of, I guess you'd expect the women to kind of be relegated to a certain role, but honestly, they barely exist. I don't know if the author had ever met one before or if he was familiar with them, the only time they're ever mentioned or ever kind of in the scene, it's literally just to advance the plot, and they have no personalities. I don't even know if any of them have names, any of the women that are briefly featured. The main character, the doctor, his mother comes to stay with him to do all his household chores because his wife is away, and obviously he can't like make his own bed and cook his own dinner. So his mother comes to take care of him, and he asks her at one point, like, what do you do all day when the chores are done, when I'm away taking care of the sick people? And she basically just says, I just sit and think about what you're going to be doing and what you're going through. And I hated this book. If I was going off of like simply my enjoyment, this would have been my least favorite, and it would have been a 1 star. But there is some good writing in it. Like there's a few sentences in the whole book that I would read and kind of be like, oh, that's a good sentence. And I know it's a classic, so I probably kind of rated it higher because of that, but I hated it. Hated. And the other 2 star I had is called Station 11. And this one, I kind of seem to be on my own about this one. This one is very highly recommended. It's highly rated on Goodreads. And I just didn't care for it. I read this a few years ago, and before I made this video, I went to try and find it to like look back and see if it was as bad as I remembered, and I don't even have it anymore. I must have given it away, and that's pretty unusual for me because I'm kind of a book hoarder, but I got rid of this one. I don't remember who I gave it to or what I did with it, but it's gone. The writing style I actually did kind of like. It's written very poetic, lyrically, what have you. Not something I read all the time, but for that novel, I thought it was good. And I remember certain passages very well. Like there's a part of it where one of the main characters is dying in the midst of this global pandemic, and she's at a hotel far away from home, and she realizes she's sick and she's dying, and there's just no one to come for help. No one is there that she knows, and she's dying on her own. And she sees this person that's also dying on their own in the hallway, and she has this really like deep moment where she's like, I see you, I know you're here. I'm not describing it well, but it's something I've remembered for a long time. So this book does have its good moments, but it goes off on really weird tangents. So it's about a plague. I believe it's called the Georgian flu, that comes out of nowhere and basically kills everyone. And the story kind of takes place like right as this is happening, and then 20 years in the future after it's already happened, the survivors. Everyone in the book the story follows, they are all connected to this guy that dies in the opening pages. I don't know, I guess it's supposed to be about the ties that bind us even though we don't realize it, and keeping your humanity after the plague, but I don't know, it just didn't do it for me. The person they were all connected to was dead, and he was kind of a jerk anyway, which we learned through flashbacks of his life, which makes no sense to me. I probably am remembering this wrong, but it seemed like an enormous chunk of this book was taken up by flashbacks to like 30 years before the plague even hit, involving this guy that's dead before the plague even hits. It's probably not as much as the book as I remember it to be, but I just remember reading it and I'm like, why are we talking about this? Like, where's the plague? Let's get back to the plague. So the parts that were actually took place while the plague was happening and while everybody was dying, and then the stuff 20 years in the future, I liked fine. But all of that backstory 30 years before, it's not a long book. So much of it was spent on that. And then I felt like it was building to something that then didn't happen, and that was really frustrating for me. Like, something has to happen, and I didn't get that out of this book. So I had one 3-star book, which is called Wilder Girls. And Wilder Girls is about these girls they attend an all-girls school on an isolated island, and they get quarantined because they all start coming down with a disease they call the tox, which basically mutates their bodies in really weird ways. Like, they'll start getting scaly claws for hands and weird stuff like that. A lot of them die from it, and even the ones that haven't died yet, like, it comes in waves. Like, even if you survive the first wave, you could still get sick with it a second or third time, and you might die during one of those waves. So everybody just lives in kind of constant fear, and they don't have enough food. And there's a lot of body horror where it describes some of the things that are happening to their bodies, and I really liked that part of it. I appreciated how graphic it was. If you're not into that type of thing, it's not for you. This one started off strong for me, but it's It's another one where the plot just didn't go anywhere. It feels like something's supposed to happen, and halfway through the book, we switch perspective from Hetty to her friend. I can't remember her name, but we switched to her perspective because she's disappeared. She's gone somewhere else. So we switch from Hetty to her, and once we get into her perspective, she acts like there's some deep, dark secret about her past or her personality or something, and it just never pays off. And eventually, there is a climax to it, I'll give it that. There's this big climax where basically the main characters just leave everybody else to die, just easily. I didn't get it. I don't know if she's planning to do a sequel, because there's a character that you think is dead that then turns out not to be dead, but like in the very last pages where they're not even able to do anything with their, newfound life. So it's just, why weren't they dead? I didn't get it. But I did rate it a little higher because I did really like parts of it, and I haven't read a book like it before. I just didn't get where it wanted to go with the plot, or what the point of it really was. All right, and then 2 4-star books. So, Year of Wonders. I read this one in 2017. I think it's actually like bubonic plague, and it's in the 1600s, and I don't remember a ton of other details about it, unfortunately. I rated it 4 stars back when I read it. I remember reading it, I remember liking it, but I guess kind of the test of a good book is whether or not you remember things about it years later, and this one I really don't. I know the main character is accused of being a witch at some point. There's a whole side plot about that, and that she's deeply involved with a priest, but basically plague comes to town, and there's an epidemic of plague in the 1600s. I remember enjoying it, but I just don't remember that much about it. So if you're looking for something in that setting though. And then my other 4-star is World War Z. And I'm curious if I would rate this higher if I read it more recently. My sister loves this book, as you may have seen from my previous videos. I have not read it in probably 4 or 5 years. I did like it when I read it, but it did take me 2 times to get through it. The first time I kind of got a little, I lost interest and stopped reading it because it starts off with a bit of a slow burn type thing. Once I got into it, when I read it the second time, I did love it, and I thought it was really good. It's another zombie one. This one I think is even more relevant to the whole pandemic plague than The Passage was, even though they're both zombies. Maybe The Passage was vampires. Yeah, it was definitely vampires. My bad on that one. You can tell I didn't really like that book. But anyway, World War Z, I think they think it's rabies, like a weird strand of rabies that is being spread and kind of zombifying everybody. And the way he details the spread of it and how it goes from country to country and place to place is very interesting, especially if you're looking at it as a disease versus zombies. The thing I love about World War Z is it really explores all the things you would, all the different scenarios that would happen during this. What would the government do once it realized there were zombies? Could you escape to the north where it's cold, where the zombies couldn't get you? Could you escape on a boat? It looks at all these different scenarios, and it's really great. I do highly recommend it. I'm not going to talk about it anymore because this is literally the 3rd video I've mentioned World War Z, but it's a good book. If you haven't read it, you should. And then on to the 5 stars. First off, so the lowest rated for me of the 5 stars, it's called Fever 1793. And this is a middle grade book about a girl who is living in Philadelphia during a yellow fever outbreak in 1793. And I loved this one when I was a kid. A lot of action, a lot of independence of the main character. She's on her own for a lot of it, and I really enjoyed that as a young girl. It's middle grade, which is why I ranked it at the bottom, but I do think it's 5 stars for what it is, which is a middle grade novel about a yellow fever epidemic. And then next, I have The Dreamers, which I just read recently. See, this is a weird one for me, because I found this one and Station 11 to be very similar in their kind of lyrical, poetic writing. However, I liked the overall plot and timeline. The way the story developed for The Dreamers was better for me than Station 11 by a lot. But most people seem to disagree with me, and I'll show the Goodreads ratings for these later, but people tend to love Station 11 and not like this one. And I loved this one and didn't like Station 11, and I don't really know why. The Dreamers is about a college town where a disease is spreading that basically puts people to sleep. So you're still alive, but you're sleeping very deeply to the point where you don't wake up. And these people won't wake up for weeks or months, some of them. And it overwhelms the hospitals completely because obviously these people have to be fed and kept hydrated and cleaned while they're sleeping. So once they've fallen asleep, if they don't get medical attention, they will die. And the book follows several different stories. One of them is May, who's a college student, and her roommate was actually the first case of this disease. There's two girls that have this father that's kind of a doomsday, end of the world type prepper. There's a married couple with a new baby, and we kind of follow each of their stories throughout the progression of this epidemic. The book did focus a lot on parenthood and the relationship between parent and child. Like, I would say that was almost the main focus of this book, was parent-child relationships. But I did still really like all of the individual stories, and I liked the book altogether as a whole. And if you're looking for less of a science-based plague and more of a sleepy, dreamy, almost fairy tale-like story, I would recommend this one over Station 11, but keep in mind, I'm in the minority there. And then next I have The Hot Zone. The Hot Zone is great. Disclaimer, it is out of date. So this was written back in the 90s about Ebola. If you are interested in diseases and plagues and that type of thing from the real scientific point, the science side, like being a doctor or an epidemiologist, that type of thing, this is a great book. The problem being that this was written before Ebola outbreak that's happened in the past 10 years. When the Ebola outbreak happened a few years back, people like myself who had read The Hot Zone were probably most of the people that were kind of being all doomsday panicky about it, because it does imply that Ebola might be airborne and other stuff that there's no scientific proof for. But if you are interested in epidemiology, if you're interested in the doctors that work closely with these diseases, if you're interested in how an outbreak of something like this might be handled under a competent, government, I would recommend this book. And then my favorite, and this is so predictable, this is kind of the granddaddy of all plague books. This is the pandemic book, is The Stand by Stephen King. I read this back in high school when I was sick with the flu, which is like probably the worst time you could ever read this book other than like 2 months ago. This is basically the book about a government-made super flu that gets out of control and kills everybody. There's a very small percentage of the population that are naturally immune to the virus, and they're the ones that survive. And once society's been decimated, they join together and start trying to rebuild everything. However, there are also supernatural elements to it. So once everyone starts congregating back together after the virus has killed everybody else, they kind of divide up into these two camps of good and evil, and eventually everything kind of comes together in one big post-apocalyptic showdown. It really has everything you could want from this type of book. The descriptions about how people die, about how the virus spreads, how people that weren't infected by the virus still ended up dying afterwards because there's no doctors, because there's no phones, there's no one to help you if you get trapped in certain situations. The way they start rebuilding kind of their pseudo-government and everything, very interesting. And then, ultimate showdown between good and evil, also good. This bad guy is just, he's very spooky. His powers are never clearly defined, so you never really know what he can or can't do or what he is or is not going to do. It's just good. I love this book. If you are looking for something about plagues, read The Stand. Fair warning, it is enormous. And there's two versions. The first version I read was the edited version, which back in, I think, the late 70s, when Stephen King was writing this, he had to cut a bunch of pages. And then however many years later, when he was, Stephen King, he went back and added everything back in, and he also updated it. If you read the older version, it takes place in the early 80s. If you read the later version, it takes place in the 90s. And if you read the later, longer version, you might notice a couple of things that make more sense if the book did take place in the early 80s. So just something to kind of consider. But overall, you really can't go wrong with either version. I highly recommend these books. All right, so as a recap, over here, I'm going to put up my ranking of everything, what I thought were the top books. And over here, I'm going to put up how that compares to how Goodreads ratings have ranked the books. That was kind of predictable. I picked The Stand and The Hot Zone. Those are also the top two. They're just really good books. I think wide appeal, and I think a lot of people would and obviously do like them. Station 11, like I said, that's kind of the one that I just did not care for, but other people really like. So take that as you will. I'm surprised the Passage is so far up on this list. It had its moment, I think, a few years ago, but I am surprised that it is as high as it is given what I thought about the writing. And World War Z, Year of Wonders are rated basically exactly as I said, so there you go. The Plague, like I said, I think it's a good book, probably, just not for me. Fever, I think, deserves a little bit of a higher rate. Fever 1793, I think that one deserves a bit of a higher rating, but it is a kid's book. Maybe that's why that one's a little lower rated. And I'm surprised The Dreamers is lower. Wilder Girls being low does not surprise me. I was just kind of neutral about Wilder Girls, and I know there's people that love it, and there's probably people that hate it even more than I did, so I guess that's how we ended up where we did. Alright, so that's my ranking of these books. If you've read them, do you agree? Do you disagree? Did I get it right? How do you feel about Station 11? If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up, and please subscribe to my channel if you'd like to see more of my videos. Thanks, and I'll see you next time.